It is a real privilege to be able to talk about Ramabai's life, an extraordinary woman. But I must confess that I'm new to this subject. And I was quite anxious about a month ago trying to prepare for this talk, going like, how am I going to be able to stand up and talk about Pandita Ramabai at the Festival of Ideas when I'm just sort of getting into understanding her life. Thankfully, through some coincidences, I happened to end up having lunch with the world's leading scholar on Ramabai. And the 2 hours I spent with him subdued my anxieties about this talk, because we compared some notes and I felt like I was at least partially on the right track. Keith White, because Mira Kosambi, who was the scholar on Ramabai, passed away recently, and Keith White, who is now based in London, is the world's leading scholar on her life, and he's working on a biography of her that will hopefully be published in the next years, and also a film on her life. So, and I think Keith and I might do something together. So I've had a chance to talk to people who know about her, and I think I'm on the right track here, but I know that there might be others here. Is there anyone here who is quite familiar, studied her life, knows about her well?
Not well, a bit.
A bit?
A bit.
Okay. I must say that the more I've studied about her life, it's actually quite difficult to think about her life within sort of traditional categories, because she crosses these boundaries, and there's a kind of paradox about her life. Now, sort of hopefully during the question and answer time, we'll have a chance to sort of unpack some of those paradoxes about her life. Just to mention a few now as I start. Here is a woman with a great sense of agency, her own sense of agency as a human being in a man's world. So you've got the sort of feminist dimension of her life, woman trying to do what she believed she wanted to do with her life in a man's world. It's also an Indian colonial subject trying to do her thing in the context of empire. The British were ruling India at that time during her lifetime, and so there's that dynamic of what does it mean to be an Indian subject in the context of the British Empire. There's also the dimension in her life where she converted to Christianity, and there's that thing, being a Christian in a Hindu world. And finally, there's also the element where she's a Brahmin, a high caste Brahmin, and Christianity mostly in India has been from the lower caste and from the Dalit background. And so some of her work has also been controversial in that sense, that she remained a Brahmin throughout her life. So we'll try to unpack some of this towards the end of our talk, but I just want to sort of, for those of you who are unfamiliar with her life, I just want to give a sort of a broad stroke, sort of tell her story, and then we'll use the question and answer time, the last 20 minutes of our talk, to unpack some of these questions. Why did she convert to Christianity? What did it mean for her to be an Indian and a Christian at the same time? And why is she so forgotten? In fact, one writer argues that her memory has been actively suppressed in India. There's been a deliberate effort to wipe her out of the history of Western India. I think I had some water somewhere. Okay, let's start with Pandita Ramabai. I started with this statement about her being a Brahmin sweeper for Christ. In fact, this is what she said, this is what she wrote in her testimony, in one of the books that she wrote about her conversion. And I'll read that quote to start off with. Thank you, Jonathan. If any of you know anything about India, sweepers usually come from the lower caste, and a Brahmin is at the top of the chain. So she said this: Christ came to give different gifts to different people. Some he made prophets, some he made preachers, some he made teachers. Since I have become a Christian, I have thought he has given me the gift of being a sweeper. I want to sweep away some of the old difficulties that lie before the missionaries in their efforts to reach our Hindu widows. So she called herself a sweeper, which I think is an extraordinary soft description for a woman who always remained a Brahmin throughout her life. So to understand Ramabai's life, who is Ramabai? Okay, so she lived from 1858, which is a year after the Indian Mutiny, if any of you know what Indians call India's First War of Independence, and she lived till 1922, a few years after the end of the First World War. So that's her timeline. She was a social reformer. She gave her whole life to reforming the plight of Indian women, particularly young girls who were widows. She's also described as India's first and, in fact, foremost feminist, a champion for the emancipation and empowerment of women. She was also India's first travel writer. She had written books in Marathi about her time here in England and her time in the US. So she was not only somebody that was receiving all the things she could gain when she came into the West, but she also started using her own mother tongue to describe the West. One writer calls it returning the Western gaze. So she wrote, her travel writings are very interesting actually. Many of them are not yet been translated into English. She was a pioneer of modern education in India, particularly the idea that education is meant to be holistic. So she wanted to include things like play and after-school activities. So she had a very, quite a unique understanding of education. We talked a bit more about that, the German education philosopher who influenced her in that. She was a linguist. She spoke 11 languages. She loved languages. In fact, she was also a Bible translator. She learned Hebrew and Greek so that she could come up with her own Marathi translation of the Bible, so that this translation would not have many of the Sanskrit words that were used in the Marathi translation that was available before. And of course, she was also a Sanskrit scholar. At the age of only 19 or 20, she was brought before a panel of Hindu scholars in Calcutta. And she addressed them and she answered their questions and she demonstrated how much she knew of the Hindu scriptures. And they gave her two titles. Actually, no Indian woman had been given these titles before that. Pandita, which is the feminine for Pandit, a scholar of great learning. And she was also given the title Saraswati, which is goddess of wisdom. That's how extraordinary she was at the age of 19. And when I met with Keith, there was a point at which he looked at me and he said, "I know what you're thinking, Philip." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "You're thinking this can't be true." And then he explained to me how this is actually true about her life. And it's a real shame that I had never really known much about her before I came to England. And 2 years ago, I started sort of reading about her life. In fact, if you ask most Indian Christians about her, they might know her name, but know very little about her. In fact, I lived in Pune for over a year, and I didn't visit this place where the center that she started is still going on. It was only about 30 miles away, and I didn't visit that place because it didn't really interest me. But now, as I've come to think about her life, I think when I go back to India and go back to Bombay or Pune, I will visit the center. So that's a little bit about just who Ramabai is. If we're going to understand her life, we need to know a little bit about sort of the background of India and the context of her life. She was a Brahmin, and Hinduism, as you know, is a religion that believes in reincarnation, that to attain moksha or salvation, there's endless cycles of birth and rebirth. And when you're born and live as a good Brahmin man, you can finally escape the recycles, your karma. India in the 19th century was also under British rule. Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India in 1887. And of course, there's the caste system in India that divides people along different professions mainly, with the Brahmins at the top, and of course you've got the untouchables. So this was, it's still there in India, but it was very strong in the time that Ramabai was living. And finally, there was a lot of social evils that affected Indian women, including infanticide, child marriage, sati, temple prostitution, and the enslavement of women. These are just basic facts about India at the time when she was living. We also should mention that there was a lot of Christian missionary work that was going on in India at that time. Baptist missionaries, Anglican missionaries. There were a lot of missionaries that were doing mission work, teaching, education, and those kind of things. And I must mention that there was quite a strong Brahmin-led social reform that was going on as well, that were trying to bring change in India from within the Hindu religion. So this is the sort of backdrop to her life. And we'll look a little bit more about her family life and just her journey. I suppose I could say there are sort of four broad, you can divide her life into four phases. There's the phase of her life from when she was born till she came to Calcutta, where she was given these titles and given a place of prominence. Then there's the phase of her life from then till she left to come to England. When she had quite a bit of platform, she was still a Hindu, but she was recognized as an Indian nationalist. She was invited to speak on how the role of women, she was actually an example at that point, in the second phase, of a Brahmin woman who actually had significance and who could do what she wanted. Then there's the phase of her life when she was outside India, when she left to come to England. She spent 2 years in America, traveled around the world, and came back to India. And the last phase of her life is when she returned back to India and what she did afterwards. So those are sort of the four phases of her life. This is a little bit about her family. She was born into a Chattapathan Brahmin family. They were Sanskrit scholars themselves. And her father was a very interesting man. And this is where you kind of wonder, her life seems to have certain things that came together. Her father was a Brahmin scholar, but he was a very progressive man himself. He was quite liberal-minded. He believed that the scriptures, the Puranas, did not prohibit women from studying. So he taught his wife Sanskrit scriptures. He taught his daughter Sanskrit scriptures. He refused to let Ramabai be married because his other daughter married when she was very young, I think around 6 years old, and she had a very difficult experience. In fact, Ramabai's mother was only 9 when she married her father, Donga, the second wife actually, Lakshmibai. And so it's very interesting how her family life influenced her. That her father, in fact, was brought before a panel of Hindu scholars to defend himself as to why he was teaching his wife and daughter Sanskrit. And he was able to show that actually there was nothing in the Hindu scriptures that prohibited teaching girls to read Sanskrit. Of course, he was able to win the case, but he felt like he couldn't do his... one of the things that he did for his life was he would go around India, particularly to temples, and sit outside and read the scriptures or pronounce the scriptures from memory. And people would give him food and give the family some sort of gifts, and that's how they lived. But he realized that at that point that it was a kind of one of the first experiences of exclusion, that the family left and went into the forest and lived there where she was born, because he felt like he was not accepted by the other Brahmin priests because he was being progressive. She was born on 23rd of April 1858 in the Gangamal Mountains in the forest of western Maharashtra. And she was given the name Rama, which is the feminine for the god Ram. And it meant fair or bright. And she was the youngest child of the family, and she was dearly loved by her father. I think her father had some kind of ambition or some sense that Ramabai had a destiny for her life. And he taught her, which is why when she went to Calcutta at the age of 19, she knew so much of the Sanskrit scriptures, is that her father had taught her in her home. They didn't have any secular education. All they were taught were the Hindu scriptures. In 1874, there's a famine in India, and all the members of her family die except her brother. First, the mother dies, and the father dies, who's usually they're living in the forest, they're eating leaves, and he sort of, the story of what they didn't even find anybody to bury the father, because nobody wanted to come and carry this man to the funeral pyre because he was already being seen as an outcast during his lifetime, and he died, and his mother died, and her sister died. But before her father died, Ramabai promises her father that she will give her whole life to doing one thing and one thing alone, which is to worship the one true God. Why her father asked her to promise that, we don't know, but she made that kind of promise to her father before he died. Afterwards, she and her brother, they were at this point, she was born in 58, she was only about 16 years old when her father died. She and her brother walk around India for about 4,000 miles from north to south. And this is the bit I thought could never be true. How could you walk around India? Most of India is forest. And then when I was talking to Keith, he said basically what they did was they would walk from one temple to another temple with the pilgrims that are walking. They'll walk with them. Once they get to the temple, they'll spend some time there. And then they'll go back with another set of pilgrims to another place. And from there, they'll go to another temple. And this is how they were able to map the whole of India, just going from temple to temple, begging for food. There is one story in Punjab where it's very cold, if you're there in December, where it was so cold that she and her brother had to dig a hole and bury themselves till neck deep so that they wouldn't die from the freezing cold. There was this, that extraordinary life that she in the midst of this, she was still begging for food while reciting the Hindu scriptures. But she also saw, when she traveled around the temples of India, what was happening to young girls that were sent to the temples after their husbands died, and they were being kept there as slaves, as prostitutes. In 1878, she comes to Calcutta finally, which at that time is the capital of British India. And there she is recognized as a scholar of outstanding reputation because she had such knowledge of the Sanskrit scriptures, but also the grammar, Sanskrit grammar that she knew. 2 years after she comes to Calcutta, her brother dies. And in the same year, on the 3rd of November, she marries a man that is not a Brahmin, a Sudra lawyer named Bipin Bihari Das may live. Of course, they can't marry in a temple, and no Brahmin priest will do the marriage because they're marrying outside of caste. So that's another attempt. You already see that she's always doing what she believes that she must do. And at that age, when she's 22, she marries Bipin, and they have a daughter named Manorama, which Mano translates as heart's delight. Sadly, 19 months after being married, her husband dies of cholera. She is now a widow at 23, but refuses to stay hidden or become invisible, which is what you're expected if you become a widow in India. You become hidden and invisible. After her husband's death, Ramabai moved back to Pune, which is where she had many contacts, and somebody there invited her to come to Pune. Oh, I must also say that when she was in Calcutta, Tilak, one of the social reformers, had given us some sort of, looked after her. And he was always talking about how we need to reform the Hindu religion, how we need to bring reform for young girls. And then she finds out that he got his own daughter married at the age of 10. And that really upset her, that here was this Brahmin social reformer that gave his own daughter away in marriage at that young age, which she was completely against. It's quite normal in India at that time for girls to be married at that age, 9, 10. Gandhi, in fact, was 12 when he got married to his wife, who was 13. So she moves to Pune, and she founds the first society she started was called Arya Mela Samaj, Arya Women's thing, society, which was basically to help widows to find a place of shelter, find some kind of security, so that they could not, many times what happens is when the husband dies, the family that she married into would beat the daughter, keep her like a servant. So she was trying to rescue them. So this was her first attempt at starting a center for women. While she was in Calcutta, she met some Christians who invited her to a prayer meeting. And she found the whole experience very strange. She found that Indian Christians were eating European food, dressing in a very strange way, and were praying to chairs. She just could not understand why they would kneel in front of, they were kneeling in the pews, but she thought they were praying to the chairs. And for her, especially as a Brahmin who had studied her scriptures, it made no sense. The whole experience, she writes about it somewhere, I wish I could find the quote, about her experience of watching these Christians, the way they behaved. Somebody gives her a Bible, a Sanskrit Bible, she reads it. In fact, I might be able to find the quote later, where she says, I looked at the Bible and it looks very nice, but when I read it, it makes no sense to me, this is just nonsense. Strangely, she goes to Assam, because that's where her husband was from, and there somebody gives her the Gospel of Luke, and she starts reading it in Bengali. And she has a lot of questions, and there was a Christian missionary named Isaac Allen, who she talks to. Then, because her husband died, she comes to Pune. There she meets this guy, Nilakant Nemaya Gora, who was actually an Indian convert, who was a Brahmin convert himself, who spent quite a bit of time here in England, who answered a lot of questions for her. So that's the phase 2 of her life, when she then decides she's going to go to England. In 1883, because one of the things that she was very concerned about is that Indian women were not going to go to male doctors for treatment. In fact, when she was invited to speak at the Hunter Commission for Education, she said one of the great needs for Indian women is that we need women doctors who can treat Indian women. And she of course realized that, if she was really serious about that, she has to go to England herself to study to become a doctor. So she leaves India in 1883, travels to England with her daughter, but when she gets here, she realizes because of she has severe hearing, she's deaf because of the famines and the malnutrition that she had to deal with. So she had become deaf. So of course she couldn't become a doctor. And while she was here in England, she promises the Indian reformers before she left to come to England that she would not convert. But when she was here in England, she converts to Christianity, which caused a huge backlash, both with the Hindu reformers who saw her as somebody that was a shining example of a woman that could be Hindu and yet be emancipated. But also the Christians in Mumbai got very upset. The missionaries were upset because they felt because she has converted, the Indian Brahmins were not going to allow them to work in India. So the Christians were upset that she had converted, the Muslims were upset that she had converted, but she believed that, the thing that impacted her was when she was in Wongate with the sisters that she was living with, Anglican sisters, she began to see how they cared for fallen women, prostitutes here in London. And that really impacted her, that actually these women would go out and take care of these women and bring them to their homes and give them some dignity. And that really spoke to her. And she at that point again met with Neelakant, who was somebody she knew from Mumbai, who was visiting London. And she asked him some questions. And, oh, I must mention that I didn't have it in the PowerPoint. She had a traveling companion that went with her from India to England. And she committed suicide when she was here in England. Her only friend in England. And I think there's a lot of controversy on why she converted. And we can talk a little bit about, was it because she was feeling lonely here? Was it because she really was attracted to Christ? But let me just read what she wrote, what she herself wrote. I felt as if a big emptiness within my heart which needed to be filled, and no one but the God who was full of love and compassion for sinners would be able to fill it. I felt I needed his help, and for the first time in my life I prayed to the unknown God to incline our hearts unto him. So this is kind of what happened, and then she took baptism, of course, which was a public statement that she had become a Christian. But I must say that her time in England, particularly when she was with the Anglican sisters, was not easy. She was a woman that had a very independent mind. So for example, when they said to her, you've got to believe in the Athanasian Creed, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, she said, why should I believe this? I don't see this anywhere in the Bible. She was quite Arian in her views. And she constantly got into trouble with Christian overseers. And let me read a quote that sort of shows how she was being described by the missionaries. If I can just find it quickly here. Sorry, because this quote I think is very insightful. Philip doesn't know where his papers are, and I think I know where it is. It's here. So this is what she says. At the same time, she's writing this to her Christian, to her sister, Sister Galdalin, I think her name was. At the same time, it does not follow that because we are friends, we ought not to have our own judgment in mind. It seems to me that you are advising me under the we, she puts the we in capital, to accept always the will of those who have authority. This, however, I cannot accept. I have a conscience and a mind and a judgment of my own. I must think for myself and do everything which God has given me to do, which God has given me the power of doing. So this is Ramabai, young Christian, writing this letter to her spiritual leader saying, I cannot accept what you're saying. This is why her life is still very controversial in all circles. This is the Christian leader writing. We've been feeling very anxious for Ramabai, and I should like you to know a little about the state of affairs in Cheltenham. I shall also enclose Ramabai's last two letters, which I received at the same day, and you will see from these that she is altogether off the lines. She had a strong, independent mind. So what happens is she goes to Cheltenham. She leaves one gate, moves to Cheltenham to teach Sanskrit there, because she was always wanting to be financially independent. In fact, even for her travel to England, she wrote a book and published it here and sold about 5,000 copies and raised money of her own to travel to England. She didn't want to depend on anybody financially. That is another extraordinary thing, because again it shows that she believed that if she was going to be doing something, she had to spend her own money for it. She is invited to the USA to attend the graduation of her distant cousin, Mrs. Anandabai Joshi, who was India's first female doctor, by a woman named Rachel Bodley, Dean of the Women's College in Philadelphia. But her Christian mother, Sister Geraldine, did not want her to go to the US. Because the problem was, all the Christian groups saw her as the jewel in the crown. They wanted to make her Baptist, or the Anglicans wanted to make her Anglican. And she decided that she was going to go to America to be at the graduation of her cousin. And her time in the US was actually quite, she struggled here in England, but she had a great time in the US. She speaks at hundreds of gatherings about the plight and suffering of Indian women and raises money for her center in India. She publishes 2 books while she's in the US, one called The High Caste Indian Woman, and also wrote a Marathi travelogue called The Peoples of the United States, in which she actually questions about the treatment of what she calls the Negroes and the native Indians. So she's actually questioning, how can you say you're a Christian nation when you do these to the... So she had a very probing mind. She studied the writings of Frederick Froebel, translated his writings, and wrote education textbooks for children based on his philosophy in Marathi. So this particular German education philosopher. She was very influenced by him, particularly his idea of the kindergarten, that play has to be an important part of a child's development. And while she was in the US, she spent a lot of time studying his writings, and in 1889, she returned back to India to start her social work. But she also traveled that time to different parts of the world, including Brazil, Japan. She wanted to see what was going on in the world. She understood that somehow her message was not just for India, but it was for the world. So let me read a quote from the High Caste Hindu Woman, 1887. There are thousands of priests and men learned in sacred lore. They neglect and oppress the widows and devour widows' houses, hire them out to wicked men so long as they can get money. And when the poor, miserable slaves are no longer pleasing to their cruel masters, they turn them out in the street to beg their livelihood, to suffer the horrible consequence of sin, to carry the burden of shame, and finally to die the death worse than those of a starved street dog. The so-called sacred places, those veritable hells on earth, have become the graveyards of countless widows and orphans. This was her. The book became a sort of a bestseller in the U.S. because she basically was talking about what was happening in women. Now she wrote this. This is her first book she wrote in English, and this book was then used by a lot of mission organizations that wanted to come to India and work. And so there's controversy on how much of this. There's a sort of a textual criticism going on about how much of this text was being written to raise funds, how much of it was written to sort of give fodder to the American missionaries that were working in India. But the fact of the matter is, what she wrote in this book, she then comes back to India and tries to change. So she was not just saying this because she wanted to publish a book. Let me read one more quote from her writings along these lines. This is again from this book. I beg earnestly the women of America and England to come to India and live in our sacred cities, not living in European and American fashion, but living like the poor beggar women, going in and out of their dirty huts, hearing the stories of their miserable lives, and seeing the fruits of their sublime philosophies. Let not my Western sisters be charmed by the books and the poems they read. There are many hard and bitter facts that we have to accept and feel. All is not poetry with us. The prose we have to read in our own lives is very hard. It cannot be understood by our learned brothers and comfortable sisters of the West. So this was basically, what is interesting is at the same time that Ramabai was traveling in America talking about the plight of Indian women, Swami Vivekananda was in the US talking about how wonderful and glorious Hinduism was. And it is in response to that she was saying, come and see what's going on in India, particularly come to our temples. And there's a lot of controversy about, which is why her place in India's story is still, like one writer said, is suppressed. But she was never afraid to speak her mind. Ramabai always said what she thought, and because she believed what she was saying was true. So let's talk a little bit about her efforts and struggles in social reform. I'll stop in a few minutes, and then we can have some question and answers. This is even before she left to go away to England. She started this Society for Women. The purpose of the society was to promote the cause of women's education and deliverance from the oppression of child marriage. She also, of course, as I mentioned before, she was invited by Lord Ripon's Commission on Education. And this is what she said. In 99 cases out of 100, the educated men of this country are opposed to female education and the proper position of women. If they observe the slightest fault, they magnify the grain of mustard seed into a mountain and try to ruin the character of a woman. In fact, Queen Victoria at that time read Ramabai's statement to the Commission and played some role in starting the first college in India for women to study to become doctors. There's no evidence that Queen Victoria and Ramabai met when she was here, but there was definitely, Queen Victoria knew about her. Finally, of course, when she came back, one of the first things she did was she started this House of Learning, and there's a lot to be said about the controversy that began to come between. She said when she left America to come back to India that the House of Learning that she starts will not convert anybody. They will be given the freedom to study all the religions. If they're Muslims, they can remain Muslims. She cared about their well-being as human beings. She didn't want them to convert. To become Christians, they should have the freedom to make that choice. She herself has a deeper conversion to Christ. She talks about how until that point she knew about Christianity, but now she knew Christ at a much deeper level. And there was also a revival that happened in the center that she had in Mukti Mission, which I'm not going to talk about. In 1896, there was a great famine in India, and she and the women that were working with her traveled around Maharashtra in bullock carts, the one that cows full. And they basically were mopping up bodies of people that were dying of malnutrition and brought them to center and fed them. There were about 2,000 people that were living there. She had a center for vocational education. She had a center for women that were old and like a old people's home. She had a chapel. There was all kinds of things going on at her center. But I do want to say a couple more things. That one of the things that she did when they had their chapel is she always wanted to make sure that they had the music there was done in Marathi, and they used the particular Marathi poet named Narayanan Vaman Tilak. I didn't know about him, but he has written over 3,000 bhajans or little songs of worship to Jesus, and they used that. And there was one time when some British missionaries came to her center and got really upset that they were using the sitar, which is an Indian instrument, for worship. And they said to her, "You cannot use this in a Christian worship service. These are instruments for the devil." And she said, "Yes, you are right. We shouldn't be using this in the service." So he said, "Please stay here in the chapel and worship the way you would." And she took the whole of her, the people that were there, and went outside, and they had a service outside under the tree, using the sitar and singing their songs. Yes, she faced severe criticism that people began to come to Christ, but she decided that like she had the freedom to make her decision to become a Christian, that the people that were there at her center could become Christians. And like I said, her life is forgotten and her life work actively wiped out of the annals of Indian history. Last point, like I said, she translated the Bible into the Marathi language. She's the first woman Bible translator in the history of the church. She translated both the Old Testament and New Testament. It took her 11 years to do it. She learned Greek and Hebrew to do this. But the Bible Society refused to publish her Marathi Bible because they did not recognize her as a scholar. So you see the power struggle that was going on between Ramabai and the Christian mission societies in India. She was also the first Indian woman to speak at the Indian National Congress in 1889. And she was the first one to suggest that Hindi should be the national language of India because she was afraid Sanskrit would become imposed on India. And she felt Hindi was much more language of the people. She was given the medal, a medal for community, a Kaiser Hind medal by the British government in 1919. And in 1889, the government in India, the Congress Party, issued a commemorative stamp, which is the photo that you see on the posters, describing her as the woman of the Millennium. And Mukti Mission still continues today, serving girls, women across India. There's about 2,000 people living there who are being served through education, through vocational training, and all kinds of different ways. Her mission still continues over 100 years later. Let me just read one last quote from Ramabai, and then we can open it up for questions. Two quotes maybe. This is what she said. "A life totally committed to God has nothing to fear, nothing to lose, and nothing to regret." Finally, people must not only hear about the kingdom of God, but must see it in actual operation, on a small scale perhaps, and in imperfect form, but a real demonstration nevertheless. And this was her understanding that it's not what you talk about, it's how you live, it's what you do. Thank you.